We ready, Keith? Okay, we are ready. Welcome, everybody, to the forum. I have been informed that I must be brief in my introduction, and you know what a challenge that is for me. So I just, first of all, just want to say hello to everyone streaming us from around the world. One of the unique ministries of All Saints Church, and we got a lot of unique ministries here, is Transformational Journeys, and it is so aptly named because it is based in the idea that when we travel, be it around the corner or around the world, we encounter difference, we encounter new things that transform us, that change who we are. And this ministry through the years, really through the decades, has transformed not just the lives of individuals in this community, it's transformed this community because when people come back changed, it changes the body of this community. A driving force behind this ministry has been and continues to be Erica Tamblyn. Yes. And what we try to do is every time a group comes back to have a debrief session with some food, which you've discovered. And we're here today to hear about really a transformative journey to Cuba. And I also hope you're going to say a little bit about the Japan trip coming and put a plug in. Okay, and so if you think this is good, there's a Japan trip that's coming up in May that you might want to be interested in. And they can ask her about that. But I am going to wrap up my brief introduction. And I'll put the mic back there. And everybody, Erica Tamblyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to talk for just a brief second. Mike talked to you about transformational journeys. I think it's important for people to know the themes of transformational journeys. In order for something to qualify to be a transformational journey, it needs to be in one of these categories: healing and reconciliation, sustainable economic development, youth at risk, especially locally, community and international health concerns and diseases such as the pandemic and gun violence, multicultural education, spiritual pilgrimage and interfaith community building, policies and advocacy of government studies, and the history of our culture. This trip would never have been possible if it weren't for global exchange. All Saints has a long-standing relationship with a wonderful nonprofit travel agency called Global Exchange that really does it for the good of mankind, and they are terrific. They have extraordinary relationships. They've helped us with many trips to Cuba, especially our trips to Vietnam and Cambodia, and this particular trip to Cuba, which was so meaningful for so many of us, and we never would have been able to have the meetings and meet with people and understand things if it weren't for Drea Hightower and her colleagues at Global Exchange and her friends in Cuba. So I know you're watching, and we thank you very much. One thing I want to ask before I get down and let people present, different people are going to make presentations today, please stop at the action table and sign our letter to President Biden and our representatives, urging them to stop the embargo from Cuba. People in Cuba, as you will hear, are really suffering, and we need to get our legislators to stop that. If you're interested in what you hear today and about going to Cuba, there's a clipboard over on one of the tables back there where you can sign up to go to Cuba. We're going to do another trip, so we don't know when yet. It'll depend a lot on how many people sign up. And now it's time for me to turn things over to Gail Gunther, who's going to talk with you about history and our itinerary. Take it away, Gail, and give me a second to get the slides. Hang on, folks, just give me a second to get these slides.
Welcome. It's so good to see so many of you, especially today when it's kind of cloudy and cold. I'm going to start talking and have one slide that illustrates what I'm talking about. The history of Cuba. So the history of Cuba, 500 or 600 years in about 2 minutes. And for your information, we have a reading list prepared that can tell you lots more, and our Transformational Journeys brochure. After this talk, I'll be standing as you leave out there, and we'll be happy to share those with you if you're interested. Columbus sailed up to Cuba in 1492. The history of Cuba is marked by colonialism, slavery, violence, oppression, disease, corruption, political opportunism, luxury. It's a brutal and very harsh history, frankly. Cuba has historically been used as a bargaining chip in disputes between much larger and more powerful countries. From 1492, when Columbus arrived, to about 125 years later, 2/3 of the indigenous people had died from the diseases, mostly from the diseases and the harsh conditions that they endured with the new arrivals. By 1763, the 7 Years' War resulted in Cuba being taken from Spain by Great Britain, but within a year it was traded back to France under the Treaty of Paris. The wealth of Cuba was really sugarcane and slaves, and sugarcane it's very brutal work to harvest, and hence the slaves were very useful in that production. In 1804, the Haitian slave revolt spread fear among Cuban slaveholders and resulted in harsher conditions for the Cuban slaves. And there was a sense, many of the French former slaveholders fled from Haiti, came to Cuba, and there was this hope that Cuba could be built into a larger, more profitable sugarcane slave industry. In December 1868, one of the Cuban slaveholders freed his slaves with the proviso that they would join him in fighting for independence for Cuba. And this became something of the beginning of a battle that went on for several decades between Spain and Cuba. Spain was a harsh taskmaster to its Cuban colony, and didn't hesitate to throw protesters into prison or execute them. Finally, by 1886, slavery was repealed in Cuba. Cuba was one of the last areas to do away with Cuba. In 1892, Jose Marti, an exiled dissident in New York, founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He went back, led his followers back to Cuba, and was killed in the Battle of Dos Rios in 1895. And as a result, he became immortalized and the hero of Cuba's independence movement. By 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine was blown up. It exploded in the harbor and sank quickly. Nearly 3/4 of the crew were lost, and this began our entrance into what became the Spanish-American War. And as a result of that war, we left with a base at Guantanamo. If you've ever wondered, and I had, why do we have a base on Cuba? It was the result of the Spanish-American War. In 1933, fast forward, Fulgencio Batista overthrew the sitting president of Cuba, and this began decades of puppet presidents being installed. Meyer Lansky, American mobster, dreamed for many years of a Las Vegas on the ocean, and his dream was to create a setting where there would be complete control of gambling, prostitution, and drugs. And Batista's government made that possible. Faster forwarding, in 1956, Fidel Castro began organizing his troops and then sailed from Mexico to Cuba. And in March 1960, President Eisenhower began laying plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1962, Kennedy announced the trade embargo against Cuba, which endures today. I also am talking about our itinerary very briefly. Do I get one more minute? No. Okay. Okay, our trip, one more minute. Our trip was 10 days. It was actually 8 days of sightseeing, 2 days of travel each way. We flew from LAX to Miami nonstop, laid over several hours in Miami, and then on to Havana. Our bags were stuffed with items that we had been asked or invited to bring to gift to the Cubans. Because of the embargo, there is no access to over-the-counter drugs, Band-Aids, art supplies, sports supplies, things that we take for granted. And so we did bring bags full of things. Our hotel was lovely, brand new, modern, built by an Indonesian group. And we stayed in that hotel for 8 days with 1 day trip to Playa Girón, or the Bay of Pigs. And what's that? Oh, okay, sorry. This is a view of Havana from the hotel room, and you can see it's a very horizontal city with not a lot. It's a spreading city, not a lot of towers. Okay, I've got to keep moving. So thank you, Bob.
I'm going to talk about the Cuban economy. As Gail mentioned, the mafia was there. They had a corrupt government, but prior to 1959, prior to 1959, Cuba was one of the most advanced countries in Latin America. They had a thriving middle class and a small, wealthy upper class in Cuba, but the majority of the population, especially in rural areas, was destitute. I mean, this was abject poverty. And there were profound inequities. So the countryside was poor, the cities were pretty wealthy at that point in time. And rural Cubans had neither health care nor schools, and most of the people were illiterate at that point in time. So in 1959, the revolution occurred, and the political and economic system became communistic. And you all know what communist means. It's really creating a classless society. And the major means of production is really controlled by the state, and there's really no private enterprise or private property in a communistic state. The country's poorest people, however, were elevated from abject poverty to just poverty. And that still is pervasive today. The majority of people that we encountered were very poor in Cuba. But racism was reduced. Medical care and education improved dramatically. They have a very high literacy rate today. But as we all know, pure communism has never been successful anywhere, and the economy is still suffering. So after the revolution, the United States, in its infinite wisdom, during a period when there was a Cold War and a tremendous bias against communist countries, introduced an embargo against Cuba. And this embargo was probably the most enduring trade embargo in the history of the world. The U.S. policy of isolating Cuba still exists, and it's a relic of the Cold War. The main objective was to squeeze the Castro regime and, convert it back to a capitalistic kind of country. And here we are many, many years later. The Castros are gone, and we still have the embargo going on. So what happened then is Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union. And you all remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, the Soviets really helped them economically. But the bad news was that Cuba became dependent on the Soviet Union. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, all that aid that was going to Cuba went away. And they went through a very, very dark economic period for many years. They called it the special period. And that ended in 2000 when Venezuela started shipping oil to Cuba. And the low energy costs really helped the Cuban economy recover. And then in 2014, President Obama relaxed many of the sanctions, and tourism started thriving, and Obama even made a trip to Cuba at that point in time. And the economy started to grow again. It was doing fairly well until the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, things started going downhill again dramatically. And that was further exacerbated by Venezuela cut off the cheap oil that they were sending. And all the fundamental pillars of the economy just collapsed. And the Cuban economy is really a mess today at this point in time. The Cubans receive subsidized education, subsidized medical care, and subsidized food. Medical care is excellent. They've got a very high literacy rate today, but the agriculture business and the food subsidies aren't so good. So most of the people that we ran into in Cuba were struggling just to have basic subsistence in terms of daily food. And largely, you know, they blame the U.S. embargo and the coronavirus. Inflation is raging at about 45% today, after last year was 39%. So poverty is still widespread. Primary industries today, still sugarcane and tourism, although tourism is about half of what it was prior to the pandemic. And of course, in his infinite wisdom, when President Trump took over, he reimposed the embargo and even made it worse by cutting off money transfers so that the Cuban people in the United States can't transfer money to their relatives back in Cuba right now. They have no access to the internet, so they can't get to any of the common things that we typically use on the internet. So mining and manufacturing are still primary industries along with sugarcane, but they're struggling big time. And what's happened now is that Cubans are leaving. In the last couple of years, there's been 425,000 Cubans that have left Cuba. That's about 4% of the population, just because poverty is so bad. So the embargo is the elephant in the room. It affects virtually all aspects of the Cubans' daily lives. The docks are half empty, cruise ships are banned, Western Union branches are shuttered, the hospitals are understocked, and it's really a failed policy. And for the life of all of us who went to Cuba, we can't figure out why this continues, because it's the people in Cuba that are suffering from this embargo, and it's not accomplishing anything in terms of politics that it was designed to accomplish. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gloria.
Hi, wow, it's great to see all of you here. I thought with the rain we were going to not have very many people. Okay, I am charged with talking about something called the CDR, which stands for Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. When you think about that name, it conjures up all sorts of images to me before we went. This group was formed in September 28, 1960, when Fidel Castro was speaking on the steps of the palace and a bomb went off. So from that occasion, he decided there were revolutionary people within Cuba who were against him, and he needed to do something about that. So he wanted to combat this counter-revolutionary activity by vigilance of the people. That was what he decided was going to fight that. So again, this group arose as a response to perceived internal and external threats. Interestingly, Castro said at the time that he perceived the threats were imperialist acts caused by the American CIA. So that's what he was thinking. So when he thought about what can I do about that, he decided he would institute community patrols. They would divide all of Cuba into small neighborhoods, some as small as a couple of blocks, some larger, and they would have 3 levels of these community groups. One, the block level, second, the district level, and then the national level. So each little group has a president or a person in charge who reports to the community people report to the district people, and their president reports to the national people. So the membership of these groups increased until it was about 80% of the population in the 1970s. So this is what I thought of after we went to the CDR, but we knew we were going to be visiting one of those CDRs. So we had some conversations where we discussed what were they. So again, it's a network of neighborhood committees across Cuba. They're kind of the eyes and ears of the revolution, and there is some speculation that these groups led to the declining role of the city government. Over time, these groups expanded to address various social issues in that little community. For instance, public health, disease prevention, food distribution, conservation, hurricane evacuations, festivals, projects, basic needs, recycling, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of what we knew a little bit about before we went to visit a CDR. The reason I chose to talk about this was it was one of the most impressive nights I spent in Cuba. We were invited in the evening to go and visit a small CDR community. We went on our bus, and our bus came to a very narrow road, and you could hear the music from back far. As we got closer and parked the bus, we were in a very, very poor neighborhood full of people. Teenagers, children, toddlers, babies, moms, dads, grandparents. And when they saw us, they were waving and very, very excited as we came off the bus. They had brought chairs from their apartments and set up little chairs for us to sit down, and they wanted to speak to us about how proud they were of being in the CDR, which is what they did. Through our interpreter, they told us what the CDR was like, what they do. They introduced us to a lot, especially of women, young women, who were in charge. They also introduced us to a 13-year-old in the community who had been to China, and they were very proud of her. She was learning to speak Chinese, and she eventually wanted to go to medical school, so they sort of put her forward as a person they really wanted us to know. It then was a real party atmosphere. They had music playing, they had a jump rope. There were some of us jumping rope, I will admit that, many of us trying to dance. The thing that touched my heart so much, and I will remember, is 2 little boys who probably were 3 years old in shorts and a raggedy shirt, sitting on the ground on the floor with their legs open, with one Matchbox car pushing it back and forth between them. And you just knew that that was probably the only toy they had. It was very kind. They made soup for us, which really was amazing. I mean, these are very poor people. And they had a big pot of soup, and they put it in cups, and we all had soup. I think when we think about transformational, I thought a lot about how did that transform me. And I think what really touched me was the pride these people felt in being a part of this organization. They really were so proud to tell us about it. They were happy to be there. They were excited and proud of their accomplishments. And I think they felt like they were a part of the government, if you will, or a part of being important to someone in the government. So that was a really impressive transformation that happened to me seeing this. Again, the CDR, the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. We'll entertain questions after, and if anyone has anything to ask, we'll be glad to answer. So now I'm going to invite Liza and Kathy to do arts, culture, and food.
Hi, I'm Liza Billington, and my husband, Corey Brendel, was on the trip as well, but he's singing in the choir, so he can't be here right now. Mic up. How's that? Better? Not great? Better? Okay. So Corey's, you can hear him right now. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the kind of the fine arts aspects of their culture that we experienced and learned about. So they do value the fine arts. We went to a beautiful, beautiful art museum, pictures. So we had a great guide. We took a lot of pictures, and he explained the different artists and times in history of the art. It was great. I'm going to get to that. We went to a dance lesson. I understand Erica has a lot of video that she will, she's got some blackmail ability. And perhaps if any of you really want to get to any of us, you could probably make a deal. It was fun. And we went to a jazz club one night and got to hear some Cuban jazz. I noticed everyone in the audience looked like us, they were tourists. There were not any locals there to hear this jazz, but it was a good experience. The one thing, or the thing on this trip that inspired me or uplifted me more than anything else was this youth theater group. There's a gentleman who's been doing this, I think he said, for 30 years. He loves what he does. He teaches these kids theater. They come after school, I think 2 days a week, and they do, I believe, all sorts of theater. For us, they did a whole program of little skits in pantomime, so there was no language barrier, and they were great. They were touching, funny, emotional. It was just a great experience. And it was a really small little kind of black box type of theater. We were sitting on little folding chairs. But afterwards, each participant got to introduce themselves, tell us their age and kind of what their dream was. And all the younger ones said they wanted to be actors. They wanted to be on a soap opera or something. They were just, well, the pictures go with what I'm saying, but I didn't really speak in order, sorry. I was inspired by that. And some of these young actors were in their 30s. They had been doing this like their whole life. My sense was it was a source of inspiration and joy for them as well. So it was just very sweet. It didn't feel like there was any subtext for the younger ones, at least. They just were having a joyous moment, which I loved. The last thing I want to mention is the Cuban ballet. They have a very high regard for ballet. They have a internationally known company, the National Ballet of Cuba. They have a beautiful historic theater named after, I can't think of her name at this moment, Alicia Alonso, thank you. She's kind of their ballet hero of all time. She was amazing ballerina. And they were not performing while we were there, but we did get to see another ballet company, which just tells me ballet is a big deal, and if you can make it in ballet, you are highly regarded. Okay, I'm done. I'm turning this over to Kathy. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about food, which is one of the things that was greatly anticipated on the tour. Like, oh, we can't wait to see what the food is, and we know it's going to be good. There's two main dishes that we had that are famous or very well known in Cuba, the ropa vieja, which means old clothes in Spanish, which is basically shredded meat that's cooked first until it's tender, usually beef or pork or lamb, not chicken, and cooked in a skillet with tomato sauce, wine, and spices. And we did attend a cooking class demonstration of this, and we got to sample it afterwards, and that was very yummy. They also showed us how to make mojitos, and that's one of their big drinks, as well as the Cuba Libre, which is rum and Coke. And almost every meal we were served one or the other. And then the other main dish associated with Cuba, there's many, is the moros y cristianos, which is the black beans and rice. And we did have that at one of the restaurants that we ate at, and it was really delicious, especially with the crushed plantain chips on top. So one of these days I'm going to have to try and make that at home. There are food shortages, and I read that one of the reasons why we didn't see any dairy milk in the hotel, and at one point in the hotel I think they didn't have eggs for a few days, and I read that it's because of they're not able to get feed for the animals, for the cattle, and for the chickens. This might be due to the embargo, also the economic depression after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the effects of the pandemic. And let's see. I also wanted to say that everyone's heard of the Cuban sandwich, but it actually did not originate in Cuba. It comes from South Florida, and I'm sure everybody knows what it is. It's a crusty bread with mustard, dill pickles, Swiss cheese, ham, and roast pork, and then it's pressed down like a panini sandwich. And if you've been to Porto's, of course, they have that. And let's see, we did go to some restaurants. There is some private industry in Cuba. They call these private restaurants paladares, and we went to the one that Obama went to, and that's called Palador San Cristobal. And of course, the food, all these places, the food was delicious. And there's usually a choice of seafood, fish, shrimp, meat such as chicken, beef, lamb, etc. And do we have the slide? Yeah, there it is, a picture on the wall of Obama, because they were really jazzed that he came to Cuba, especially being a black man. And the majority population of Cuba now is descended from the people that were enslaved. Okay, and we also went to, I'm going to pronounce this right, La Bodeguita del Medio, which means the little bar in the middle, and supposedly this was a Hemingway hangout and the home of the mojito. And of course, I mean, none of this food was bad, so, and we also went to the Hemingway bar, La Floridita. Oh, there we are, okay, MB and the bartender. That's a really cute slide. And we had, we went there in these little, funny little taxis called Coco taxis. They look like, kind of like a Disneyland ride or something. I have a picture of that. So that was fun just getting there. And then, of course, we had hors d'oeuvres and drinks, so that was very enjoyable. But unfortunately, the Cuban people do not enjoy such food as the tourists do because of the shortages, and their diet is deficient in, I would say, meat and fresh fruits and vegetables, except for the native tropical fruits and the mostly starchy root vegetables such as yuca, taro, things like that. So that's it.
Hi, I'm Bonnie, and one of the things I want to start with is that there's 12 categories of tourism that the U.S. allows to Cuba, and we were on, as somebody's mentioned, the people-to-people category. And as you can see, well, part of the requirements are that the travelers have a full-time schedule of activities that result in meaningful interaction between the traveler and individuals in Cuba. And so it was a full-time schedule, and as you can tell from the prior presentations, there's more in that 8 days than we could cover in probably 24 days. So we're kind of struggling to keep up with the bounty of wealth that we had there. The first picture here was on our second day. Well, and I do want to mention, I'm just going to hit very broad impressions. And of course, the people of Cuba are as diverse and complex as, in fact, tremendously so, maybe more so than any place I've been. The first place here is an art gallery that we went to, an art project on our second morning there, and it's called Corral Falso 259. The exhibit that we saw was the life cycle of, human life cycle represented by documents. And so the early documents were just very lightly charred. And then as you progress through the exhibit, by the end, you came to more highly charred, representing end of life and death. And what that did for me was really introduced me to how much creative energy there is in Cuba. And so this was early on, and we saw it play out everywhere we went, in the people, in the places. It was really quite amazing. I'm not big on Facebook, but as a result of being to this place, I do follow them now, and have been really interested in some of the latest exhibits and pictures of the gallery openings. There's appears to be quite a middle class, or certainly a college class of students and artists that are at this place in many of the photos. This next place was kind of a surprise. I think Kathy just talked about the being on the Hemingway Trail and at the Bodeguita del Medio. I'm not one of the Spanish speakers on the trip, but when we went there as scheduled, it was high noon and it was packed. And so they said, okay, we're here in the Cathedral Plaza. We had been there earlier in the tour, but they said, take an hour, just go hang out. There's the cathedral, there's shops, and you come back at 1 and we'll be able to get in for our lunch. So it was one of few moments of kind of open time, and of course in open time, serendipity always comes. So the place that we went to, you'll see here, was called Jorge Oliva Gallery, and it's a place that does jewelry and sculpture in filigree, and they start with a very fine wire, either of silver or copper, and then they split it into, I can't remember, was it 100? Yeah, very, very fine pieces, and use it to shape the jewelry and the sculptor. So what happened here, and you see Candace carrying on exactly as we had learned on our schedule itinerary, engaging and learning all about how this was done, speaking one-on-one with the man that was the master artist there. My takeaways from this were, that serendipity does always happen. It was another creative space with absolutely gorgeous jewelry and sculpture. The model that we were seeing in many of the places we went was very intergenerational. So there would be someone that was in the theater, someone that had been practicing for 30 years. There would be adults or college-level folks participating, as well as down to little kids and primary school people on occasion. This last place is they wanted me to talk about the cars. And so we went to a place called Nostalgia Car, and the guy that's standing there with our guide, she's in the green, and his name was Julio. He is one of what is now called cuenta propistas, which are the, in 2011, Raul Castro legitimized the and regulated a class of self-employed people, so non-governmental workers. And it's really putting together a new model of direction for the economy. By the end of the year 2018, there were nearly 600,000 Cubans who were self-employed, which was about 13% of the workforce. 33% of them were women. They are primarily in paladars, the taxis, private leasing of residents to tourists, none in manufacturing or industry. And my takeaways from that were, as Bob had mentioned, they are a very highly educated country overall. The man here, his father had been a mechanic for General Motors before the revolution. He graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. His wife studied chemistry and had worked in marketing for the government before they formed their own business. It was a place of creativity and persistence to be able to come to this place. Certainly the pride and joy that was mentioned, and the face of the new Cuban economy. Thank you, and I'm going to have Tony speak next.
I'm going to talk about knitting. Just kidding. The Cuban boxing team is, they're not allowed to go professional, but I see it as a sign of their resiliency that they're amateurs and they've been the best. Although we are, and we turn pro very fast. They say amateurs. And we used to have USA versus the world. We would compete against USA versus France or USA versus Poland, and it would be all 12 to 15 weight categories going against their team. The one team we have never beat is Cuba on a one-on-one. We've never defeated them. But now individually in an Olympic pairing or Pan Am Games, we have. But it usually is for the gold medal because they're usually right up there. And so the Cuban boxing team, like the country, is full of resiliency. Their baseball was they were going to try to have, when Obama was president, they were working out to where they can become professional, play here and go back. But some other guy shut it down. I won't say his name in the church. And especially in the 70s and 80s, they dominated with their heavyweights. And even the people that became champions were taken out, actually. They had one of the greatest heavyweights was Tillfield Stevenson. And he knocked out John Tate, who was an American heavyweight champion later on when he became professional. So, and what we saw in the Cubans is that they are fundamentally sound. I mean, meaning they're taught well. And that's something we saw in the gym. They had a little exhibition for us. And that's what I noticed. In boxing, it's a hit and make a miss. And then you hit. It's not just, but I see the spirit, the resiliency in the country, in everything. But in that is something they have in amateur boxing, they have over us. And I hate to say that.
Thanks, Tony. One day, we were scheduled to visit an urban farm on the outskirts of Havana. Nothing about the approach to the site said rural or agricultural. The road leading up to it was lined with gray, prefabricated concrete apartment blocks in classic Soviet style. But when we got off the bus, we were greeted by a farmer in jeans tucked into rubber knee-high boots, a plaid shirt, and a baseball cap. What we learned was that before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba's agriculture was mostly sugarcane, and they imported 80% of their food. Soon there was a hunger crisis, and the government threw its weight behind an organic revolution. supporting the growth of a network of small rural farms and urban market gardens. The adoption of organic farming principles came out of necessity. They had to switch from tractors that used fossil fuel, which they could no longer import from the Soviet Union, to teams of oxen, 2 of whom we met in person. They resurrected and taught indigenous farming methods, seed selection, and worm cultivation for composting. Organic farming also requires more human labor, so it led to higher levels of employment, and now it's a staple of the Cuban economy. Visiting this farm was a nice change of scene from the big city. We saw ingenuity and dedication to hard work going on all around us. The one image that stayed in my mind was a small group of women sitting at shaded high tables on the equivalent of bar stools with large nursery flats in front of them. These flats were divided into 1-inch squares filled with potting mix, and into each little square, these women were meticulously placing exactly 3 seeds, separated out from a pile. And those seeds were no bigger than poppy seeds. I noted the very long fingernails of at least one of these women and imagined they were just the thing for that precision task. When the seeds produced sprouts, those would be transferred to pots and set in a greenhouse to reach the right size for planting in the field. Next, you can't help being impressed the minute you step inside the Partagas cigar factory. The lobby opens all the way to the top of the 4-story building. And there's a 2 stories tall photographic portrait of Fidel Castro smoking a cigar that dominates the space. Balconies surround the lobby on 3 sides, and we followed Augustine, our guide, upstairs to see the huge room where men and women sat at row upon row of desks, rolling cigars by the same method used for 200 years. The room is kept at a particular temperature and humidity, so we could only watch through windows as each worker constructed cigars from start to finish. They would have separate bundles of 3 types of tobacco leaves: fillers, binders, and wrappers. And after rolling into a cigar-shaped bunch that was placed into a plastic mold in front of them, the bunch would get its cut-to-spec wrapper leaf. Augustine had worked at this factory for many years and explained that the workers have a quota to fill each day. When that quantity gets the inspector's approval, the worker is free to go. After 9 months of training, cigar rolling is considered a well-paid job at $10 a day. There's a bonus on top of that, too. Each worker gets 10 cigars per week of their choosing, and they can sell them to supplement their wages. An interesting and unfactory-like thing that it's been a tradition through the years is to hire a person to read to the workers as they're rolling cigars, starting the day with the newspaper and moving on to works of literature. Finally, while some simple tools were employed to achieve a consistent product, Cuban cigars are truly made by human hands, and watching that process was fascinating.
We're going to have a little bit of talk about religion in a second, but can we say goodbye to the people who are streaming? So wave goodbye to them. And for those of you who are streaming, come back next week, actually come here. Eddie Anderson, who's an amazing pastor and preacher, pastor of McCarty Memorial Church, and also candidate for LA City Council and the co-director of the Poor People's Campaign for the state of California, is going to be here to talk about how we can gather as people of hope in an election year. And so bye to the folks online, and now here's Elizabeth.
I will